Okay, so this is our last video lecture on the topic of adolescence. And in this lecture, I want to talk about juvenile delinquency and a little bit about sex. I realize this is a little bit out of order from what's in your chapter, in your textbook. That's because some of the slides get written using certain textbooks and then they change them and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so on the topic of juvenile adolescence or juvenile delinquency. Again, this is a social construct. What we mean by delinquency, basically, it's a fancy way of saying when a juvenile or somebody who's not considered an adult breaks the rules. And we're always trying to answer why, to ask why do some people break the rules and other people. Some of the variables in here suggest that maybe it's because the brain's not fully developed, or perhaps it has something to do with input. So in other words, if a child lives in a home where there's a lot of rule breaking, then their brain develops in a way that makes them more at ease with breaking rules, right? That's what it means. It grows what you tell it. Poor impulse control, that could be a neurological condition, these kinds of things. So there does seem to be some patterns that rule breaking runs in families. Teasing out exactly if that's genetic or if that's social environment, but certainly we do see those patterns. There are some social variables, of course, similar to family. You might be living in a community, your peer group, right, who you associate with. A couple terms here that are bolded worth pointing out is something called the unsocialized delinquent and the socialized delinquent. The unsocialized delinquent is a young person who breaks the rules effectively because they've got no one telling them not to. So they're little supervision, little parental guidance. They just do whatever they want. And because remember we were talking about cognitive development, the ability for moral reasoning, but because they have not completely formed cognitive and moral development, they don't know right from wrong, or they're unable to distinguish right from wrong. The socialized delinquent refers to someone who breaks the rules because it's part of their peer group, right? They're just kind of going along with their group. There is some evidence that suggests that depending upon the stage in which a juvenile or a non-adult breaks the rules or becomes delinquent, it will predict how long or what kind of delinquency they get in. In other words, that the older a person is before they do their first criminal, before they vandalize the first time, or before they shoplift the first time, or before they sneak into the movie theater, though the shorter this period, the shorter period of time. In other words, if the first time I steal anything is when I'm 15 years old, I'm not going to become a lifetime crook. But if I start stealing at 11 and I continue to steal until I'm 15, then that may be sort of a precursor for a life of crime. Hopefully that makes sense, that there are some. So I have been known to say I would fall into this category of a socialized delinquent because there was a little period of my life when I was, 13 or 14, where I broke the rules and probably took something from a grocery store or snuck into the movie theater when I was with certain friends, but it didn't last very long, right? As opposed to an unsocialized delinquent. This is the slide that is sort of out of order, at least in the orange fonted book. But there are some things that I do want to point out because I also realize that this content is covered. It's just not covered in this sequence in the chapter. A couple really important words on here, phrases, is this one right here, double standard. And what we refer to by the double standard are those sort of cultural messages about sexual activity, and the message that says that it's expected and more desirable and more okay for boys to have lots of sexual partners, but it's not appropriate for girls to have sexual partners. In other words, the rules are different. Maybe you've heard something called the principle of threes, and the principle of threes refers to that girls will divide the number of sexual partners they have because it's inappropriate for them to have very many, and boys will multiply the number of sexual partners they claim to have because it is inappropriate for them not to have very many. So a boy will say he has 3 partners when he only had 1, and a girl will say she has 1 partner when she's actually had 3. That's the double standard, right? It speaks to who makes the first move, all of those rules, those kinds of things. Another thing that I do also mentioned in a previous video lecture was this idea about virginity pledges. And that is simply what the research tells us about virginity pledges. And that's when people publicly commit, to abstaining until their marriage, that they don't really seem, they're not terribly effective in promoting in promoting safe sex. They do appear, actually your textbook says they don't even do that. The textbooks used to say that they do appear to delay sexual activity, but when young people engaged in activity, they were less safe. But I'm pretty sure I read here in your textbook that they don't even delay sexual activity. There's a discussion in your book about California. So the federal government said to these states that they would only give money to fund sexual education if they promoted abstinence only. And California, it says, was the only state that refused this particular pool of money for abstinent-only sexual education. And California saw their teen pregnancy rates go down, but none of the other states that promoted abstinence only. Because when we talk about abstinence only, we don't talk about safe sex practices, which includes consent and contraceptive use and how to prevent from a sexually transmitted infection. Okay. A couple other things on here, the teenage pregnancy. What can I tell you about teenage pregnancy? You'll see throughout textbooks and social science books, you'll see references to when you see teen pregnancy, there's higher rates of poverty, there's more rates of dropout, there's absent fathers. Don't confuse that with causation. In other words, yeah, those things fall, they show up together. There's a correlation between teen pregnancy and poverty, but poverty doesn't cause teen pregnancy. Necessarily does teen pregnancy cause poverty, but all of these things show up together. They create a culture, a community where there are lots of pieces, there are lots of things that may contribute to a young person at 15, 16, 17-year-old engaging in unprotected sex. It's not just poverty. Poverty may make it hard to pay for contraceptives, or poverty may mean that your mother is not home after school, so there's no supervision. Poverty doesn't cause teen pregnancy. It is one variable that creates conditions that make it more likely, more common for a young person to engage in unprotected sex. I used to say that if you lived in rural America, the only thing that was available to you was to drive fast and have sex, because, back then, this was, in the 80s, there were no roller rinks, there were no movie theaters. So what is a young person to do? Right. Okay, so I think that is about it. Teen sex education in schools, availability of contraceptives, teen pregnancy. Yeah, I think this wraps up the chapter on adolescence, and the next chapter will be on young adulthood. No, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my early adulthood. Sometimes it's called emerging adulthood. Thank you for listening.